Welcome to Blue Book Citation Module 2.2, which covers Chapter 10, Prior and Subsequent Case History. As an introduction, one case may go through several levels of appeal in its life. At each level, the court reviewing the case may publish an opinion. Opinions issued by courts that review the case after the opinion you wish to cite are called subsequent history. For example, if you are citing an opinion from the U.S. District Court, subsequent history would include later opinions from the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court on the same case. Opinions issued by courts before the opinion you wish to cite are called prior history. For instance, if you are citing to an opinion from the U.S. Supreme Court, prior history would include the earlier opinions from the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals and the U.S. District Court on the same case. You can find prior and subsequent history on LexisNexis through the Shepherdise function. In Lexis Advanced, the Shepherdise button should be on the upper right-hand corner of your tab when looking at a case. And you'll see the nifty little arrow there pointing to where the Shepherdise button will be. You're welcome. And then on Westlaw 2, you can find the same information by clicking on the tab that says History when looking at a case. These rules will be kind of complicated, but you don't need to commit them to memory as long as you have the blue book by your side. For guidance, you can turn to rules 10.7, 10.71, 10.72, and B4.1.6. The ICW chapter dealing with prior and subsequent history is Chapter 10. And since we just discussed short cites in the last module, it bears mentioning that you should never include subsequent or prior history in short cites. As I just mentioned, in the Blue Book, Rule 10.7 covers when to cite subsequent history. Generally, you should include the subsequent history when you cite a decision in full, but there are some exceptions to that rule. First, you do not include subsequent history if that history is a denial of certiorari or a similar discretionary appeal. This means that you need not mention subsequent history if it is only an attempted appeal to a higher court that the same higher court denied to hear. However, you should include denials of certiorari, I think that's how it's pronounced, in the full cite if the decision is less than 2 years old or the denial is particularly relevant to your discussion or the point you're trying to make. Second, you should not include subsequent history if the history is a denial of a rehearing or is on remand, unless this type of history is particularly relevant to the point cited. Third, just kind of popped up from the bottom. But third, you should not cite subsequent history that is disposition that has been withdrawn by the deciding authority. Put more simply, because I don't even know what that means, if the appellate court said or did something in its subsequent history that it later rescinded, you don't need to include it. Let's move on to prior history, which, like subsequent history, can be found under Rule 10.7. Unlike subsequent history, you generally do not include prior history in your full citation. This makes sense if you think about it. When you give a citation, you want to make sure that you accurately represent the current state of the law. Whatever the highest appellate opinion of a case says is what's legally binding. You generally include subsequent history because there are higher appellate decisions on your same case that trump it. In counter to that, you generally do not include prior history because the earlier opinions from the lower courts do not trump the primary case that you are citing or the primary cite. However, you should include prior history when it is significant to the point for which the case is cited, or when the decision cited does not intelligibly describe the issues in the case. To put it in a less blue booky way, you should include prior history when the appellate opinion you're citing to for a case simply does not describe the facts or a specific issue in the case as completely as a lower court opinion for the same. Now let's go over how to cite to prior and subsequent case history, the actual mechanics of it. You put the prior and subsequent case history after the full citation of the primary case. In most situations, that means that the history cite will follow the primary cite's court and date parenthetical. But if the primary case includes an additional parenthetical after the court and date, the history goes after that too. The history cite is introduced by an explanatory phrase. You can find a partial list of explanatory phrases in T8 in your blue book. For illustration, revd means that the subsequent history reversed the opinion you're citing, and revg means that the case you're citing reversed the prior history. Whenever you're citing to prior history, the introductory explanatory phrase should not be followed by a comma and should have the ing suffix, usually shortened to an apostrophe and a g. Introductory explanatory phrases for subsequent history cites should be followed with a comma and end with the ed suffix, usually shortened to an apostrophe and a d. Now, I just realized that all of that may have been terribly confusing, so here's a few examples to help you out. In this first one, let's imagine that we're citing to this Sevi case when it was decided by the U.S. Court of Appeals. But then it went up later to the U.S. Supreme Court and was reversed by the Supreme Court. You can see here that the full cite to the primary opinion is followed by a comma, and the primary opinion is the opinion by the U.S. Court of Appeals. It's the 123 P2D 456 2011. And then the subsequent history, where it's reversed by the Supreme Court, is 678 U.S. 910. The second example with our good friend Janky v. Poop Deck throws in a parenthetical. We haven't yet dealt with parentheticals, so don't freak out when you see this. The parenthetical here is just the part in parentheses that says, explaining that Poop Deck is a terrible name for a bar, which is true. But in general, a parenthetical is just an additional tidbit of information explaining how the cited case is relevant to your argument. The main point here is just that the prior or subsequent history comes after all of the information you want to give about the primary cite. So, since my parenthetical here that says explaining that Poop Deck is a terrible name for a bar applies to the case at hand, which, as you can see, it says F3D. That means that was probably decided by the U.S. Court of Appeals. That parenthetical applies to that opinion. It doesn't apply to the subsequent history, which says affirmed by the Supreme Court in the case 689 U.S. 532 in 2009. That was a lot of explanation. I apologize. Now, notice with this last example, we're dealing with prior history. We don't provide the prior history in the cite, as I just covered in a prior slide, unless there's a special reason to give the prior history. Here, I'm just going to assume there's not. Now, what do you do if you want to cite to an opinion's prior history and subsequent history? For example, what do you do if you want to cite to a case by the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the intermediary decision, and you want to provide the subsequent history, which would be the U.S. Supreme Court, and you want to provide the prior history, which would be the U.S. District Court? If that's the case, you append the prior history first and follow it with the subsequent history, separated by a comma. See the Blue Book's Kubrick example for an illustration, and for your convenience, I've even put it up for you right here, right now. You're welcome. Also, what if the subsequent history itself has subsequent history, or the prior history itself has prior history? Then you append the history in chronological order, separated by commas. See the Blue Book's Herbert example for illustration in Rule 10.71a for general guidance. And look, I even just gave you the Herbert example. I'm a really good TA. Now, what if the case you want to cite to has been overruled? Look to Rule 10.7.1c for guidance on this issue. A case has only been overruled if a later decision by the same court or a court with appellate jurisdiction over that court explicitly repudiates that case. Now, this doesn't really count as prior or subsequent history because it's a different case altogether that's addressing the one that you want to cite, not an earlier or later stage of the same case. But even though that's true, the format for overruled cases is very similar to the format for citing history. This is how you do it. After you write the full citation for the case, you type a comma in the phrase overruled by in italics. Here's an example from the Blue Book of how to use overruled by. As you can see, it's pretty simple. Let's move on. Now, how do you do the date of decision in the parentheses when you're doing parallel citations? Well, I can tell you, Rule 10.5D will help you with that, and I'll also help you with it right now. So, if the opinion or opinions you're citing to in the history were decided in the same year as your primary citation, then you note the year only in the final court and date parenthetical. So here you can see that North v. South, when it was at the trial level, was decided in the same year as the subsequent history, and both were decided in year 1. So I only put year 1 in the last date parenthetical. But what if you have 3 citations, where the primary case and the first subsequent history were decided in year 1, but the second subsequent history was decided in year 2? If that's the case, then you include no year for the primary cite, year 1 as the year in your first history cite, and year 2 as the year in your second history cite. Blah, that was a long sentence. Hope that made sense. Now, what do you do if you want to cite to prior or subsequent history for a case where the case name changes on appeal? If the names are simply reversed, then you don't have to do anything. For example, if the case name changes from Smith v. Jones to Jones v. Smith on appeal, then you just cite the history per usual without mentioning the changed name. The same goes for when the history cite is a denial of certiorari or an administrative action in which the private party is the same. However, you do have to do something if the named party changes on either or both sides. If you want to indicate a different case name for a subsequent history cite, add the phrase sub nam to the explanatory phrase and give the case name along with the citation for the history cite. If you want to indicate a different name for prior history, simply give the case names for both the primary and prior history cite. Unlike with subsequent history, you do not introduce the changed name with sub nam. Here are some examples for illustration. If the primary cite is Man v. Wild, and the subsequent history that affirmed that opinion is Man v. Food, then the subsequent history is introduced with affirmed sub nam. Now, let's look at one with prior history. In this example, the primary cite is Man v. Food, and the prior history that is affirmed by that opinion is Man v. Wild. Thus, the prior history is introduced only with affirming, and sub nam is left out. And that's it for this slideshow. Enjoy, it's done.